Before we get going today, if you can, just hit that subscribe button. Really appreciate it and show your support for this podcast and this information that we're putting out. Now, today, the topic is what plants are toxic to your horse? How do you spot them? This is a critical podcast for any horse owner because no matter where you live in the world, there are going to be plants that are toxic to your animals, and chances are they may come across them and they could get sick and in some cases even die, which we're going to talk about today. And if you think about it, the cycle of not just plants but weeds is a big concern in many of our paddocks and pastures, where in the spring, summer, lots of growth of grass. And, if weeds hadn't taken root there, the grass flourishes. But as horses graze, sometimes with their grazing patterns, they may graze an area intensely. Depends a lot on your pasture management. And that could leave a bare area where weeds can take root and take hold. And we typically see that no matter where it is in the world, where weeds can start to invade a pasture or ring a paddock or, even elsewhere on your property. And then oftentimes people will go and plant things to make their properties look nicer, their gardens nicer, without knowing these plants could kill your animal if they eat them. So, again, a lot to consider today, a lot that we're going to talk about. And really, the challenge with this podcast is it's going to be difficult to tell you, yeah, this is that plant, that plant, that plant, that plant is toxic, because there are hundreds of plants throughout the world that are toxic to horses. And in the modern world today, we see plants that normally weren't, say, in North America, being imported in, like a lot of ornamentals and things for gardens that we come to find out are really deadly. So, I'm going to give you some tips today on how to identify toxic plants and then what to do with them. A lot of management. How do we manage our horses so they don't eat them? Because usually a horse will not go and eat something that is toxic to them. Many times these are bitter tasting, they're not palatable. The horse won't want to eat them and they'll tend to avoid them. But there are situations like, say, a horse is really hungry where they will, or you just have that horse, no matter what, they're looking for trouble anywhere and they'll go and could possibly eat a toxic plant. And it's not just weeds. I mean, you're talking trees, shrubs, and then again, these ornamentals that are found in gardens throughout the world, and they're being shipped around the world, to be grown and cultivated. And we find them not just on our properties. We find them in, obviously in different gardens, but along trails or landscape where horses might, graze a little bit if you're out with them. So, pretty fun journey today. So, we're going to talk about, the issues with horses eating these plants. How toxic are they? How do we identify them? So regionally, that is a challenge to cover it in an hour, but I'm going to give you some tips and some tools to use that you can start today and start identifying plants. Then we're going to talk about what parts of the plant or which ones are really the ones you really need to look out for. They're really deadly. We'll definitely highlight that, and symptoms to look for to see if your horse is experiencing a toxicity event or a poisonous event. And then going to finish out with some management tips on how you can, hopefully limit your horse's exposure or even prevent. So we'll talk a lot about that towards the end of the podcast. But like I said, this is a global problem. And when you go into the scientific literature, so I go and do a search and find out what are the issues with toxic plants. Article after article comes up discussing this, which plants are toxic, case studies, and overall studies. So Here was a review article in Equine Veterinary Education just a couple years ago, plants poisonous to horses in Europe. And I have a case study here out of Australia. And then I know in North America, I'm going to talk about that. Definitely a big issue. So it is global. So here is an example, another paper. This was a veterinary journal out of Brazil, published recently. And it talks about toxic plants affecting the nervous system of ruminants and horses in Brazil. And I highlight this one because finding statistics on how many horses die per year due to toxicity of plants is difficult. And I've got a couple studies that kind of highlight this. But in this study specifically, they said yearly it kills up to 38,000 horses per year in Brazil. So that is a lot of horses that are dying to eating these toxic plants. And when I went to go look for, say, statistics in Europe or in the United States, North America, that is a little bit more difficult because, as this paper out of UC Davis states, and I'll quote it here, as difficult as it is to estimate mortality losses from consumption of these plants, it is nearly impossible to determine the sublethal effects of consumption of toxic plants. So even this paper said it's very difficult to, estimate mortality because without doing a necropsy, sometimes horse owners won't want to spend that money to do it. Without a veterinarian able to identify specifically, or that horse was observed eating plants, sometimes these numbers are very difficult to come up with. But the National Academy of Sciences, which is, some of the top brains in the United States, estimated that 8.7% of the nutritionally sick animals in the Western United States are sick as a result of eating poisonous plants. Now, just because a horse eats a weed doesn't mean it's going to kill them, but the sublethal effects, it could make them sick, right? It could make them not perform well. It could make them, suffer other issues like laminitis that we're going to talk about. So it doesn't always have to be mortality. These plants can cause a lot of issues with horse health, horse well-being, overall horse happiness. So I think that's an important point to make while I highlight the mortality, because again, that is the one we want to avoid the most. Now, when you look at how many horses die per year eating toxic plants, a very conservative estimate, I guess, again, this was out of a paper out of UC Davis. It's titled Poisonous Weeds, Their Impact on Livestock and Man. And this was dated. This was about 40 years ago, 1985, when this was published. But again, it's an ongoing problem. Even some of the older studies I saw from the 1940s and 1950s talking about toxic plants to livestock animals and horses. But in this paper, they said losses in horses is more difficult to obtain, but is conservatively estimated to be about 2% annually. So that's a conservative estimate. And then they went on with a table and they did an even more conservative estimate of just saying, hey, what if 1% of all the horses in California die each year due to plant toxicity? Well, back in 1985, there was 570,000 horses in the state. So that's 5,007 horses died that year. That's a conservative estimate. So if you did 2%, that's close to over 11,000 horses dying each year to toxic plants just in the state of California. So if you carry that out, very conservative estimate, 1 out of 100 horses will die from eating toxic plants every year. If I go to the United States and the conservative estimate's around 8 million horses, that's close to 80,000 horses dying every year eating these toxic plants. So that's a big issue, and if you carry it to Canada, that's thousands of horses there. You go to Europe, that's thousands of, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of horses around the world. Get down to Australia, so it's a big concern, and it's probably a concern of yours. That's why you're watching this. But again, this is how this podcast is trying to help you and others get out there. So again, why would a horse eat toxic plants? You always have that one that's just, wow, oh, that looks kind of yummy, and they go and eat it, and it tastes kind of off, but they're like, whatever, and they eat it. You have that type of horse, but typically what we see a lot of horses is there's just a lack of forage, and they're hungry. They didn't get enough feed that day, or it's late summer or late fall or autumn, going into winter. The pastures are pretty barren, not growing as much. And wow, that green looking plant over there looks kind of tasty. And they're hungry and they're not getting enough nutrients. And they'll wander over and they'll eat it. And that's what happens, so, in management, you want, again, to jump ahead, but to get to management, we want to make sure we're feeding our horses as much hay as they can eat per day. And that's where nutrition's changing a lot now in the 2020s. But, it takes a lot of pasture management there too, where you make sure your horses, if the pastures aren't productive and the horses aren't getting enough nutrition off the pastures or gut fill or all those things, then we need to supplement their feed. We need to start to do that. Other things, nutrient deficiencies. I will say this here, and we're going to have future podcasts on this. I don't care where you live in the world, your hay or your pasture is going to be deficient in something. It will be deficient in some nutrients. We know after doing analysis after analysis after analysis that hays and forages will be deficient in certain minerals or certain vitamins. And just to give you an example, the big one that maybe you are familiar with is selenium deficient soils. Throughout the world, there are soils that are deficient in selenium. It's a very important antioxidant. And that forage growing on that deficient soil means it doesn't have any selenium or very little. Hays grown on those soils mean they don't have very much selenium or any. And so when you feed that to the horse isn't getting any selenium in their diet. And that's just one nutrient. I mean, there's many nutrients that they're missing. So you want to make sure you're feeding your horse a well-balanced diet. Again, management. And, the other thing is boredom. The horse is curious. So that gets into, lack of stimulation, lack of exercise. Maybe the area they're in is very small. They can't get stretched, and they start developing those stereotypic behaviors. That's one thing. It could be a habit that they learned when they were young and they were curious. Again, that horse that just finds trouble wherever they go. It could have been something like, "Oh, I remember eating that when I was young," because they're curious about the world and they're curious about what to eat and what not to eat. And so they may go, "Oh, I remember that." And some taste good. And one thing is red maple leaves, the iconic leaf of the Canadian flag, is something that horses may seek out. And I found this quote in an article, and it said, "Some harmful plants are attractive to horses at certain times of year. For example, wilted red maple leaves are among the plants most toxic to horses, but they can be hard for horses to resist because the leaves' high sugar content draws the animals." And then this is in, obviously Canada, but also in like parts of the United States where there are maple trees, red maple trees. Said horses can be exposed to red maple leaves in the fall when drying leaves blow into pastures. Ingesting 1.5 pounds is toxic in a horse. 3 pounds is lethal. So that's what, half to 1.5 kilograms, roughly. Not much. Not much. So that's a challenge, right? That is a big challenge. So if you have red maple trees on your property, you need to get rid of them. If you have horses, you absolutely have to. And I'm sure some of you have or know of people that have, but then what do you do about your neighbors? We'll address that at the end. So How much do they need to eat before it's toxic? We're talking up 3 pounds of maple leaves in a horse, which could be quite a bit. Certain plants, you don't need to eat as much, and the big one is yew. And a very small amount of this plant, and I'm going to talk about it. It's like an evergreen plant. As little as a few ounces of these leaves can be lethal to a horse within minutes to hours of ingestion. So, this is a popular ornamental plant shipped around the world. So, wherever you live, there's probably somewhere in your countries or wherever that is. A few ounces can kill a horse. So, that is very concerning. Uh, o- uh, Oleander. So, these ornamental plants, the leaves can be extremely toxic and potentially fatal to horses. Ingestion of a few leaves can cause serious cardiac issues. And I've got an example coming up here in a minute. Red maple, just talked about that. The rhododendrons and azaleas. Sorry, I'm not a plant person. But again, a few leaves of those, and they're popular ornamentals. A fiddleneck, foxglove, and then the list goes on and on and on and on and on. But sometimes just small amounts of these can be toxic, or the horse has to eat quite a bit. And like I said, the yew tree, all parts of the tree are poisonous, and the leaves are really toxic when dried. And it's usually when people are trimming these bushes because they grow out, and people will trim them, and those can blow into a pasture or a paddock. Or I even saw an example of saying, hey, your neighbor doesn't know anything about horses, and they trim their trees. It's like, oh, maybe the horse will want to eat this, and they go put it over the fence, and they just killed your horse. So that has happened. But when I started this research into this topic and to really get into more depth, and I would always, whenever I taught toxic plants, my advice was always talk to your local experts, have them walk your pastures. Again, this is more into management tips, and have them try to identify any toxic plants in your gardens. Now, this was a couple decades ago when I started teaching at the university level and going out and talking to horse owners, but we actually now have more technology that you can utilize, and you can do the walk yourself and try to identify these. Now, I'm going to talk about that here in a second, but it can be frustrating because there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of plants that could be toxic. One good source is the ASPCA website. And again, I roll that website as I talk. Quick video I splice in so you can see the list of 277 plant species that they list that are toxic to horses. Okay, then they have a list of 142 plant species that are not toxic to horses. And again, check that website, and the ASPCA horse plant list, they have a list of a lot of toxic plants. And then you click on that plant and they have good descriptions on it. And I'm going to talk about an example here in a second. So it can be frustrating because it's not like 3 or 4 plants that I could talk about in this video podcast and say, look out for these. It's, wow, here's hundreds of plants that could be very harmful to your horse that you need to be aware of. But when I went to that list of the toxic and non-toxic plant list, again, ASPCA, the first one at the top is Adam and Eve. It's called arum, lord and ladies, wake robin, starchroot, bobbins, cuckoo plant. And you can click on that, and it shows a picture of it. Looks like a big lily, and it is toxic to dogs and cats as well. The toxic principle is insoluble calcium oxalates. And the clinical signs, if a horse ate the Adam and Eve plant, is oral irritation, pain and swelling to the mouth, tongue and lips, excessive drooling, which we'll talk about slobbers here in a little bit with our clovers, vomiting, but horses can't vomit, so cats and dogs would vomit, difficulty swallowing. And this is an ornamental plant that is originated in, believe in Vietnam, in Southeast Asia, but found, oh no, native across most of Europe as well as Eastern Turkey and the Caucasus. Sorry, there's all these different plants. It's a flowering plant and it's ornamental. And you're probably sitting there like, okay, somebody plants that in their garden. My horse is never going to see it. But like I said, sometimes people make, places out near their properties around their barn facilities to make them look really pretty, to make them look really nice, high end places. And they'll go and plant all these beautiful flowers and things. And if you're out there with a horse on a loose, lead rope and they kneel down, or put their heads down and they start eating, or they could grab some of that plant. And again, for some of these, it doesn't take much to kill them. So you want to be very, very cautious with these plants, especially like around the property line or again, your neighbors. And I've got a case study here out of Australia that typifies what happens sometimes with these ornamental plants. So this is titled Suspected Nerium Oleander. So it's oleander poisoning in a horse. Published recently, and this was published out of Australia. So this horse was out of Australia. And oleander is a very toxic plant to horses. Again, beautiful flower that people plant all around the world. And the issue is cardiac glycosides that is very deadly. And sudden death is most common result of plants related with cardioglycoside toxicity. Now, this case study was a 7-year-old Arabian horse, and all of a sudden, the owner noticed it wouldn't eat and looked depressed. I mean, obviously, the horse just went from fine to starting to crash, and something doesn't look right. So then when the vet went and did the physical exam, the horse was in moderate body condition, so it wasn't starving. So it wasn't eating something because it probably wasn't getting enough food, or, at least it looked like the horse was in good condition. So you can inference from that. Mild signs of depression and had elevated respiration rate, 40 breaths per minute. Had irregular heartbeat at 40 beats per minute, had a arrhythmia. So on presentation 3 hours later, the horse was dehydrated. It had, 56 breaths per minute, had reduced gastrointestinal motility. So that leads to colic. The mucous membranes were pale, pink, and dry, and the capillary refill time of 2 seconds. So this horse was starting to crash. It just was getting worse and worse. And then they started intensive therapy at the vet hospital to try to save this horse's life. But after 20 hours, it died. And then they asked the owner, further questioning the owner indicated that the horse had exposure to oleander clippings for the 24 hours preceding presentation. So this property or wherever it was, they had clipped the flowers back or the plants back, and the horse went and ate those clippings. It doesn't say if they fed them to the horse or not. And then it died within 24 hours, roughly, of when the horse owner noticed this. So oleander is also known as rosebay. It's a shrub or small tree cultivated worldwide in temperate and subtropical areas as an ornamental and landscaping plant. So it is very deadly to horses. And it's just one of the hundreds that horses could, eat that could cause problems. So how do you identify the plants in your area? Because again, this is regional. What plants I have here where I'm living are going to be semi-different. Again, I have many plants here in New Zealand that are similar to North America, similar to Australia, obviously, and then Europe. But again, our natives down at this part of the world are different than, say, native plants in the Americas. One of the things you always want to do is constantly walk your paddocks and pastures, often to look for weeds or plants that don't belong. They're not normal part of your pasture. And then note anything unfamiliar to you, any plants or weeds that aren't normal there. And also, if you have no idea and you have tons of plants in your pastures or around your property, Start trying to identify them. How do you do that? you know, so how do you do that? If you can, like if you live in the United States, I would speak to my local extension office if you have it available to you. Ask one of those officials to come out and walk your property with you. They're trained to identify toxic plants to livestock species, and they'll be able to go, yep, that, and that. And they can give you advice on, how to maintain pasture quality, all of those things. If you live in a country that has a service like that, I would use them. But if you're on your own, one of the things, here's an app you could use. Embrace technology. And I would suggest using the iNaturalist app. And you can get it on your phone. And I'm going to talk you through it here in a second because I did it before making this presentation. It is an incredible app. It's fun too. You can use it outside of looking at plants, but you look at any type of plants wherever you are in the world. It also identifies animals, which is, insects and everything when you take pictures. But what you can do is take a picture of the plant, then go into the iNaturalist app and upload it, and it will identify that plant. Now, it may give you a couple different options because it's similar. So you may have to take a couple different pictures, or you can ask for help. But this morning I went out in my garden and I have a big weed and I took a picture of it and I uploaded it to iNaturalist and it came back as European black elderberry. So obviously not native to New Zealand, but obviously the Europeans brought lots of stuff here that don't belong with our natives. But that is a plant that is seen in parts of Australia and New Zealand and obviously other parts of the world. I didn't know if that was toxic to horses or not. I looked at it. I said, I wouldn't want my horse eating it, but okay, here's this noxious weed, or it looked like a weed to me. And I went and looked up and searched the internet, elderberry and toxicity with horses. And lo and behold, yeah, it's pretty toxic. It's pretty bad. It's called common elderberry, black elder, European elderberry, European black elderberry. Produces clusters of large, flat, fragrant, white, tiny umbrella-like panicles, these flowers, and they appear in the spring, and then they remain in bloom until the fall. Then it produces hanging clusters of blue, black, fleshy berries, and they appear in late fall and replace the flowers. All parts of this plant contain cyanogenic glycosides, what we just talked about with this horse that died in Australia, can be toxic to horses if ingested. The bark also contains calcium oxalate crystals. So here I have a plant right behind me, just right over there, that is toxic to horses. I didn't know it, didn't even know what it was. So that plant is going to get pulled this weekend. So that is one thing you can do. You can walk your pastures, walk your property, walk your paddocks, take pictures of plants you don't know, make notes, make a little notebook or something. Then go back and sit in comfort of your home and you can start identifying those plants and then just start doing some internet searching. Is this toxic to horses? Or go to the ASPCA website or go to a resource in your area of the world and that identifies toxic plants for horses and see if you can start to identify if they are. And if they are, you want to get rid of them, right? So that's what we're going to talk about here in a little bit. When I talk about specifics, like I said, U was really big to give you some idea of the resources available to you, and everywhere I looked, when I looked in Australia, New Zealand, Europe, the UK, on an example here, there are websites and pamphlets and a lot of stuff out there now. So the information age that we live in, thankfully, this information is available to you at your fingertips or on your phones. You can look this up. But here was one example: is plants poisonous or harmful to horses in the north central United States? Now, this could probably apply to other parts of the USA, obviously, and parts of Canada, because very, very close to that. And this was published by the University of Minnesota Extension. They publish some amazing stuff. And when you open this up, it's over 40 pages, but they talk about black walnut, chokeberry, different types of clover, maple, again, oak, uh, all those different types of plants are discussed in there. And then there's a chapter on plants that cause death. So that one I highlighted. Specific species was foxglove, that rhododendron, that oleander, and that yew, the Japanese yew. Those plants are horrific for horses. Foxglove was introduced from Europe. Rhododendron, including azaleas, is native to North America, Europe, and Asia. Okay, so that's most of the world. Oleander is native to the Mediterranean and Asian countries, but again has been exported around the world. And Japanese yew was introduced from Asia. So those plants are used for landscaping throughout much of the United States and Canada. And there is a resource for you that you can go and has a good list of the most common. Doesn't mean it's all of them. Again, that's why you want to walk your property and identify the plants there. But just be aware that resource is available to you online. Then you can go to the MSD Animal Health website for the UK. Poisonous plants that can damage horse health. They have ones ragwort, foxglove, buttercups, yew, oak, rhododendrons. Again, they list them there. So there's a resource for those in the UK. And again, Europe has that paper. So there's a bunch. And then if you're ever curious on specific plants, you can go to madbarn.com. Tons of articles on tons of different plants. Oxalate toxicity, what does that mean? Buttercup, black walnut, I'm going to talk about here in a minute. Slobbers, I'm going to talk about here in a minute. All of those, if you go and search for toxic plants. Okay, so we talked about why care, because it can kill 1% to 2% of horses per year. That's a conservative estimate. So 1 out of 100 or 2 out of 100 horses per year, which isn't good. That's not really good. We talked about resources for you, where you can go and use an app, iNaturalist. Again, it's available worldwide, or there's other types of apps out there that identify plants, walk your properties, identify every plant that's within anywhere where your horses can get at it, and anything toxic. We'll talk about what to do with it. And resources available to you online where you can go and find more information on trying to identify the type of plant, right? So there's hundreds of them. Now, when you ask what parts of the plant are toxic, is it just leaves? Is that what just the horses are eating? Or is it the flowers or the seeds or things like that? So when we talk about some of the more deadly ones, the yew plant, all of it's toxic. The leaves, bark, seeds, and berries. Red maple, it's primarily the leaves that are wilted or dried. Okay, that is what carries the toxins. Oleander, all parts of the plant are considered extremely toxic. They have the cardiac glycosides, again, that can cause heart problems and death. The rhododendron and azaleas, okay, all parts, including the leaves and flowers, contain toxins. Foxglove, okay, that's one that's pretty deadly. Again, all these plants are beautiful too. I could see where, you plant these flowers, they're really pretty, but wow, they just stay away from horse farms. All parts of the foxglove plant are toxic. Black walnut, I'll talk about that one a little bit more. It's a tree, obviously, concerned with shavings and used as bedding. Fiddleneck is a beautiful flower. It's got like yellow flowers. It looks like a fiddle, as it goes in. Seeds in the foliage are toxic. So nightshade, the berries and foliage contain solanine, which causes gastrointestinal distress, and then that neurological symptoms, nervous system. Nightshade's really bad. Bracken fern, all parts of it are toxic. Hemlock, all parts of that is toxic. Oak, the leaves and acorns contain tannins, which can cause kidney damage and gastrointestinal irritation. How do you get rid of oaks? Like, especially in the southeast of the United States, is oak tree heaven there. And again, I remember we had large oak trees on all of our properties. I think the big thing is that's where it came into management, where you don't want horses eating the oak, um, yeah, acorns and leaves and stuff because they're hungry, right? So you have to make sure they have enough forage and stuff. So, you know, I would treat all from reading that list, and those are just some of the more deadly ones. I would just treat all the plant uh, deadly, and you just want them off your property. Now, talking about symptoms, this is where it gets difficult because a lot of the symptoms could be disease, could be other things, and I think that's why it's difficult to say exactly how many horses die per year with toxic plants, but if we start going through the list, it just sounds like any other illness. The first thing is changes in behavior, like that case study where the horse is lethargic, depressed, not eating, isolated from conspecifics from the herd, doesn't move well, just is not well. You're like, okay, that horse is ill. Something's wrong. With the gastrointestinal system, they can get things like colic, or this abdominal pain. It's painful, diarrhea or constipation. The neurological, they become wobbly. Again, that's why this is difficult. If is it a neurological disease, like I've talked about in the United States? Is it West Nile virus, or is it a plant toxicity? And that vet's got to figure it out. And without you spending hundreds of dollars in diagnostics, you spend what you can to save the horse, but a lot of times owners can't afford to do something else on top of that to identify because they don't want to spend the money or don't have the money. Muscle tremors, seizures. I mean, that just all sounds like neurological disease. One of the things in here I put here, because especially with gastrointestinal, slobbers, where the horse has excessive drooling. Now, there's a good article again on madbarn.com on slobbers, but you ask the question, does your horse have the slobbers? White clover and red clover commonly seen. These are legume plants that grow, and you definitely can see white clover in horses and pastures that are really overgrazed. The white clover plants are stressed during either really hot or drought conditions. So the fungus that grows with those legumes grows rapidly on the plant, and it produces a toxin called slaframin. It stimulates the salivary glands in the horse, and it causes them to drool. And sometimes you see it with red clover that's baled in hay. Usually, if you remove the horse in the pasture, it should subside. Okay, and it's certain horses have different sensitivities, but it's not deadly to them. But you just want to be aware of it. Okay, my horse has slobbers, and it's you just want to that means something's not quite right with their feed, and you need to make adjustments. Okay, but it doesn't mean it's like a toxicity where they're going to drop dead, where we see with some of these others. But be aware of that. And again, you can chase down more information on that on the Mad Barn website. Other types of symptoms, and again, these are all irregular heartbeat, increased heart rate, a weakness, or they may even collapse. The cardiac system, the respiratory, increased respiratory rate. We just talked about that with that case study. Nasal discharge. I mean, come on. I have a horse that's ill, lethargic, nasal discharge. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, they get flu. What disease do they have? But it could be toxicity. And you wouldn't even know it. Kidneys can shut down, livers can get damaged, jaundice, so yellowing of the eyes, mucous membranes. So again, if you notice any of those symptoms, that's clearly an emergency. Call your veterinarian. And I talked about it last week about when to call your veterinarian. Any of these signs, absolutely call your veterinarian and get them out there quickly, because you want to get them treated. And unfortunately for that Arab horse I talked about, it did end up dying, but with a lot of that supportive care, horses can pull through. Okay. They get better and they flush it from their system, the toxins from their system, and they're fine. Okay. So that's a lot of information. And really what it boils down to is managing risk. And just keep this in your mind when you think about toxic plants: detection, removal, and prevention. Okay, detection, removal, and prevention. That should be your toxic plant management plan. So, detection. You need to go out and walk your pastures. You need to go out and walk your property lines and walk around your facilities. If you board your horse at a facility, walk it. That's, don't just depend on the barn manager there. I was a college student managing a barn. We didn't look for toxic plants very often, if at all. We were busy. We were feeding horses, managing the property, cleaning up, dragging pastures, doing that type of stuff. Sure, I didn't even know. Like I said, I didn't realize I had this toxic plant in my backyard for horses. So we weren't trained professionals. And some of you may have people like that. So don't depend on somebody else. Do it yourself. Okay. Detection. And that doesn't mean there's awesome barn managers. I just say from my experience, I remember helping manage farms. It wasn't something in my forte. And it wasn't with the other college student that I was helping manage the barn with. It wasn't in his forte either. So, but I know there's some incredible barn managers out there. I'm just saying, take it on yourself just to double check everything. But walk, identify plants, use that app, take pictures, any plants bordering your pastures or paddocks. If your neighbors have toxic plants to your horses, like they have maple trees, maybe it's something that you can talk to them about removing. If they have a yew plant, definitely beg, plead, plant something else. Or if they do, ask them if they ever trim those plants, not to definitely please pick them up, because they could blow into your pastures with the wind. And be very, very, like, again, with, like, say, the red maple trees, during the fall or autumn, make sure if those leaves are blowing onto your property, they get picked up. Okay. So just be aware of that. But you want to remove any and all potentially harmful plants. And if you do pick them or pull them, make sure you get the roots out of the ground so it can't grow back. If you're using an herbicide, make sure you're using one that's going after the plants you want to kill, and then follow that label carefully, especially on how long to restrict horses from grazing. Okay, so after you spray herbicides, there should be a keep horses away for X amount of days, or until a good rain comes or until you can irrigate, something like that. So make sure you read that carefully, because you don't want to spray a herbicide, turn your horses out, and they get poisoned from that, right? And that's not going to help. More detection, check your hay. So buy weed-free hay, but always look through your hay bales, look for any contaminants. That's always just good practice anyways. You want to make sure you have clean hay, clean from any trash, debris, but then weeds. So look through that, or any other plants. And then your bedding. Know what your bedding's made from. If you stall your horses or use bedding in your stalls, do not buy shavings from black walnut. So I told you I was going to get back to black walnut. This is where we see problems, where black walnut is poisoned to horses. Horses can get laminitis just standing in it. And again, a wonderful article, madbarn.com, black walnut tree poisoning in horses, symptoms and treatment. And it said researchers believe that a toxin from walnut shavings is absorbed through the skin around the coronary band, which increases blood pressure in the hoof and induces acute laminitis. It's like the whole world's just out there to get your horse. It's not, I promise you. Just, you got to just take some of these steps and these precautions, and you should be fine. Okay. So our detection, and then here is where we get into prevention. And really, more podcasts on the way, talking about diet, and then we'll talk about pasture management. Those are the two big ones. Here is how you manage the risk. This is how you prevent a lot of this. Is You want to make sure your horse is eating a balanced diet. They're getting all their nutrient needs, because we know if they're lacking certain nutrients, they may just go eat other plants to try to fill those gaps on its own. But you know, free choice hay is probably the best advice I can give, unless you have really productive pastures. But that leads into pasture management when, say, late summer or late autumn, fall, going into winter, when your pastures aren't productive. That's where you're going to get into feeding hay. With your pasture management, depends on where you live in the world again, but for most of us in the world, we need to pull them off those pastures, let them recoup, let them rest. They're not productive in the winter. They're not growing. Late summer, they're pretty barren until those cool season grasses kick in. So a lot of considerations with pasture management if you keep your horses on pasture. So those are the times of year when the pastures are really low, they're not productive, the horse is hungry, and wow, there's that green plant. Let me go eat it. So those are two huge topics. It's something that we have to address further on in this podcast in future episodes, and they're coming, I promise you, as well as a nutrition course, which we'll be plugging here very, very soon. But you want to ensure your horse is getting as much forage as they can per day. And generally that's feeding a lot of hay during those times of year. Like I said, where I was living, we had lots of acorns, lots of oaks, but we always had ample hay or good pastures in Florida. So we had big round bales out there for them to eat, or there was plenty of grass for them to eat. And those pastures, don't let them be overgrazed, because that's where weeds come in. Once it's overgrazed, some of that grass dies off. Here comes the weeds. They're like, "Ooh, there's an opportunity," and they get planted. And then the next thing you know, you have a very weedy pasture, which is very dangerous. Then the other thing is enrichment, that boredom, right? That horse that's like, I want to go find some trouble. So I did do a podcast on how do stereotypic behaviors impact your horse. If you haven't seen that, go listen to it. Some tips in there on how to keep your horse occupied. There's now stall toys, there's pasture toys. I even did some research with students. Do they play with big rolly balls? They did. They loved it until they blew away into the ponds and the horse couldn't get them. So I remember that we had to go wait all day long until the wind blew the ball back at us. But yeah, the horses love stuff like that. So, um, you know, keep them healthy and happy. And hopefully they'll avoid those plants when they come across it. And you keep them well fed. Give them choice. Hey, you got all this hay that you love. You don't want to eat that bitter plant over there, right? You want to eat all of this. And then that bitter plant shouldn't even be here, because I've been detecting and removing those. So remember, detection, removal, and prevention. Those are the big ones. Final tips: clean your feed bins, buckets, and feeders, because sometimes seeds can get blown in through the air. They accumulate. Horse will eat those. Again, some of these can be toxic, so you want to make sure you clean those out often. And it's despite all these efforts, it still may happen. But if you ever recognize any problems, call your veterinarian. But use that app, that iNaturalist app, identify the plants, make a list, see if they're toxic to your horse, then go through that detection, removal, and prevention. But do this and your horse is going to thank you. I mean, they will thank you. And, save yourself some vet bills and some heartache with your horses getting ill. So that's it. I know it's a lot. It's a big, big topic, but hopefully that gives you some tools and some ideas that you can take and make some alterations. If hopefully you found that helpful. If you really enjoy these podcasts, please thumbs up, subscribe, all the general YouTube stuff. Then also you can always go to madbarn.com. Like I said, that Learn tab, articles, not just on toxic plants, over 500 articles. I think we're kicking out 2 or 3 a day at least, from all of our talented PhDs, DVMs, master's degrees, equine enthusiasts. They're all doing an outstanding job there. Check us out on social media, and stay tuned, because we do have that Mad Barn nutrition course just about ready to go, I think, here in the next few weeks. So check for that free course on how to feed your horse properly. Some in-depth stuff, especially when we get talking about hays and minerals and vitamins, and how we need to meet those needs, and that goes hand in hand with preventing this toxicity. So thanks. Stay tuned. We'll be back next week with another topic.